I want to start with my father's father, my paternal grandfather. He grew up in a family of 9 children on a farm outside Vilna. He didn't like farm life. It was poor and difficult. So he decided that he would try something else. And he went, I don't know where, perhaps to Vilna itself, and became, or tried to become, a cobbler. And I didn't know anything about his background, and neither did anyone else, and he never told me. But he worked with my father. My father was in the restaurant business and had a delicatessen in Cleveland Circle. And one day we were working together, and after the lunch hour, mid-afternoon, and it must have been summer, I must have been out of school, we went outside and stood on the sidewalk to get some fresh air, or as fresh as the air can be, on a hill that marathon runners broke their hearts on during the annual Boston Marathon. And as we were standing there, a friend or a crony of his came along, about his own age, and he was in his 70s at the time. And I don't remember exactly what happened, but he must have said, "Hi, Ralph." My grandfather's name was Ralph Swartz. And Ralph, my grandfather, greeted him. And the man must have asked him, "You never told me, Ralph, how you got to this country." And so my grandfather told the story. Now, maybe he was shrewd, and maybe he told it because he knew his grandson was sitting there and might one day be able to relate that story to posterity. Or maybe he wasn't shrewd and simply gave the answer and ignored me. But I stood there quiet as I could and listened, because it was the only time I ever heard about his background. My grandfather was about 21. We don't know for sure because we never sure of birth dates. But he was 21 when the Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904. And there he was, a poor, impoverished Jew in the vicinity of Vilna, and he was drafted into the Tsar's army. And my grandfather was a good-looking man. He probably would have looked good in a uniform, but he was a country boy. He was not good at taking orders, and he grumbled when he took them from my grandmother, his wife, later on. But he must have been an indifferent soldier. In any case, he was walking along the sidewalk, and this is the story he was telling his friend. He was walking along the sidewalk in the village, wherever it was, where he had been receiving his training, and an officer walked by on the other side of the street. There probably was no sidewalk in those days, but he was on the opposite side of the street, and he failed to salute. Now, I don't think you need to salute an officer when he's on the other side of the street, though I don't know how wide the street was, but he may have been guilty of being a Jew while breathing. And therefore, he failed to salute. He was thrown in the brig. And he was told when he got out that he would be sent to Manchuria. And though you may not know this, the Tsar's army was very poorly commanded, very poorly equipped, and the Japanese were chewing them up like crazy on the Eastern Front. There were stories, and my grandfather didn't say this, but there were stories that the Russian soldiers didn't have rifles. The first wave would go forward, and when they were shot down by the Japanese, the second wave would pick the rifles up. So my grandfather knew this was pretty much a death sentence. And even though he was sometimes a timorous man, he knew he had to do something about his situation. So when it came time for him to go to the Eastern Front, he asked for a leave of absence before departing to visit his family. He was granted that. And instead he bargained with smugglers to take him out of Russia. He paid the fee. I don't know where he got the money. Maybe his family raised it, helped him raise it. And he was taken with a large group, I assume of men, to the border with Germany. And in the night, they were put into a barn filled with manure, where they stood in the stench. And there was such a large group that the smugglers divided them into 2. And my grandfather hoped that he'd be able to go with the first group and get out of Russia just as soon as possible. But unfortunately for him, he thought he was in the second group. So he waited in the barn in the stinking mess, trying to be as quiet as possible with the other men, while the smugglers took the first group to the border with Germany. As they waited there, shots rang out. They became frightened. The smuggler came back and said the first group had been shot by the Russians trying to escape. My grandfather then thought, Beshert, I'm in the second group. So they took the second group, and finally he did get across. And I assumed that since it was the German border and they were probably in the north, that they left from Hamburg for America.